In this video and in a series of videos, we're going to be talking about how to make photorealistic water textures. On the left here is the default, just the water clear. It's basically same as glass. It's just a little bit blue or green tinted, and it has a perfectly smooth reflection, which is just fine if you have a pool that's perfectly smooth with no disturbance whatsoever, no pump, no wind, or no rain affecting it. But generally, you'll have things like pumps and different things, and you'll want to call some attention to the water itself, make it pop a little bit. This is very easy to do with something called a bump map. So this is noise applied with a bump map texture. Now, rather than editing one of the existing ones, we'll just make one from scratch here. Go to New Resource, New RenderWorks Texture, Water Example. And then in here for color, normally you don't want to leave this at Object Attribute because when you have water, you generally want it to be one color for pretty much everything in your scene. You're either going to have it all be a pond, so it'll be greenish or brownish, or you'll have it all as interior water like a pool or a fountain, so it'll all be sort of blue or gray. So generally we want to change this to color. And for the time being, we're just going to pick a very light blue. I'll explain more about this later, but this is fine to start with now here. I like to do for reflectivity, I normally choose glass. You can use, or a mirror. You can use glass as well. I like to use glass for the transparency, but mirror is useful because not only does it let you change the color of the reflection, it lets you set how reflective it is. So sometimes 100 is a bit high. You might want to do something like 90. And you can also make this blurry if you want to. Now, blurry is an expensive option, and we can sort of get this effect with noise or the bump shader instead. So we'll go at that next. For transparency, we usually like glass for a couple of reasons. Mainly because it refracts properly, and water has it'll say down here if you hover over this, a value of 1 is no refraction. So it's perfectly straight water. There's no refraction to it at all. Water has a refraction index of 1.3 or 1.2. We'll use 1.3 here. And if you look at the text near the bottom of this dialog, 1.5 and 1.6 would be like architectural glass or plexiglass. Again, you can change the color and absorption color here too, but we won't alter these for the moment. We'll just leave this as blue. And then for the bump. Now, so we can't see anything here. It's just a regular square pane. If I turn this to a sphere, however, you start to see that sheen, and that comes from the reflectivity, the mirror reflectivity, and it's a very light color here that comes from the transparency. There's no other objects to reflect off of in here, so we just get a sort of a perfect sheen on our marble here. However, if we go into the bump texture, we could use an image. So if we had an image of water, we could simply put that in here. But there's a lot of the time you'll get patterns. You'll get repetitive patterns in the water, and they become very obvious very quickly. Using something like noise makes procedurally generated shapes on it, so which just means they won't have a tile. It creates them as you go. Water will almost always want to cast shadows and receive shadows. You can see here, the lighting coming from above is going through a few skylights, and you can see the shadows are resting on the water. That is how it would look in real life. That's receive shadows. Cast shadows means that it actually will darken the objects underneath it. And again, you almost always want that on, unless you're going to be, though you pretty much always want that on. So whether your light is coming from the pool, like from mood lighting from the side of the pool, ambient lighting out of there, you want cast. And if you're having a bright day scene like we have here, you'll want it to cast shadow to be dark underneath that. So generally these two should be left on. You can, however, go in here to override indirect lighting and disable emit and receive light. Generally, water textures, unless your scene is actually underwater, indirect lighting is a very expensive rendering option, but it looks very good. And the rest of the model will benefit from having indirect lighting enabled. But water itself doesn't necessarily. It takes a long time to render. And honestly, in most cases, I don't notice much of a difference between the two. It being turned on and it being turned off, the emit and receive light, other than the rendering time is significantly more increased. The only time you'd want to turn portal on is if you have water that light passes all the way through and it's going to light the area inside. It tends to make a bit more better ambient light, but this is very uncommon. I think an aquarium or a huge aquarium wall would be something that you would do this in and not much else. So we'll go ahead and leave this. And this would be the same for a number of different glass and water options. And we can see here, we turned on noise and we can sort of see it, but we can't quite get an idea of what we're looking at first. However, I wanted to note something. Since we don't have an image here, we just have these procedural ones. When we have noise here, it's applying a little bit of a box noise shader to it. We don't know how big this is. So there's no way to tell it, oh, this wave is exactly 1 foot wide. So what we can do is we can say that our sphere, for instance, if our pool was 25 feet wide, we can simply do 25 feet for the sphere. And now you can see the bump gets a little smaller. So if I did something like 2 feet, you can see the bump is a little larger. You can start to see the particles there. But if it's 25 feet, then it's too small. We've made waves that are a little too tiny. So we can change this. Instead of 1, we can go up to 5. This will actually change the size of the displacement. Hit tab so it'll update that. That's a little low. Let's try 50. That's a little high. Let's dial it down to 25. See what that looks like. And you can check the plane here too to get that idea. It might be a little small. Let's see. However, this isn't very intense. So what we can do now is go into Edit. And the pattern is very important too. So we'll go and, to be honest, many of these will work just fine. For most water, I like to use Wavy Turbulence. And then you can tell you can barely see it here. We can fix that with strength. We can turn the strength up here and you can start to see water. You can start to see the actual water appearance. Now, there's a few other options in here that we'll talk about later. But for now, we'll just go and turn on Wavy Turbulence and turn the strength to maximum. And you can see here, now we can get it. We can get a little bit of that wrinkly water. So you see, instead of that perfectly smooth sphere we had before, we now have this that'll sort of reflect. And it'll actually change the reflection as well. It'll increase or decrease the reflectivity to make a distortion. Now, what we could do in here, I'm going to make this a little larger actually. If we went in here and we edited it and we changed the displacement map height to something other than 0, if we made this, for instance, 2 inches high, will actually generate displaced geometry here. Now, that might look very good if you're looking very, very close at the water. We'll wait for it. You can see it's rendering here in the bottom right. We'll wait for this to render. Displacement mapping, as you might know, takes a lot of time. So it does look better. It looks like there's actual 3D dimensionality to it. Displacement mapping is better for that. But that render took maybe 6 to 10 times as long as the simple one did. So if we edit this, set this back to 0, we get our plane and hit OK. It renders in just a second. You can see it looks still pretty good, but it happens very quickly. Don't use displacement unless you're going to have the camera or the viewpoint almost exactly in the water. There's really not a lot of point to spending that rendering time looking at something like this from this angle, because you would only barely notice it right under the edge here, and it would take a lot longer and look very similar. So the bump shader is really what you want to do to get a good look at that. And I want to show you some other bump types now too. If you use that type. So you can have what we had before. So there's the no bump, there's low turbulence, and I think what we used was wavy turbulence before. You can see here there's a few different options, so we'll focus on these first. Wavy turbulence and high turbulence, they tend to be two good noise selections in order to get the kind of displacement or bump effect you want for water. There's a few other ones that look cool, but don't really look like water at all. So wood, Voronoi 2, and box look very cool. Voronoi 2 would make a very cool like stained glass window or some sort of skylight, but it doesn't look like water at all. And this one is called random, which at best it looks like ice, and maybe at worst it could look like there was rain falling in the water, but again, it makes an almost opaque surface. It really is not a good choice for it. And again, what I'm talking about is this. If you go to edit these options, these are the different noise options available to you under noise, wavy turbulence. So one of the ones we did was wood, so you can see that pattern over there. I think this one, this is what we used for this. So we got the sort of fractal bent angles here. And then there's a few other ones in here that work very well. Cell and box, for instance, don't work well because they make very strong objects. And a few of these other ones sort of work, but they're more better for concrete or ice. They're not really designed for something like this. Cranal looks okay, but it looks sort of obviously fake. Water very rarely looks like this. Turbulence, the different turbulence options, displaced turbulence. And I specifically think wavy turbulence is probably the most water-like of all the different options. You can also change it and stretch it sideways too. So for instance, the global scale, U, V, and W are up, down, left, and right scaling. So if I make this 1,000 instead, you can see I've stretched it left and right. If I back that off and make the vertical 1,000, I've stretched it vertically, and you can sort of get a wave effect for it. But we'll go ahead and cancel that, and I'll show you how that looks. Oh, and then this is the various levels of intensity. So for instance, this is no noise whatsoever, no noise shader, just the transparency and the reflectivity and the color. Noise intensity, this is turned a little bit higher, and this is turned a lot higher. So you can see, we can almost barely see through the water at all. This is more appropriate for like an outdoor lake or a pond. This looks like wind-affected water. This looks much better for a pool. You can almost always see the bottom and see the contents of the pool. In a lake or a pond, it's almost never visible. Some people have asked if they can use parallax instead of displacement mapping to get the water effect. However, I will show you this. Here's parallax at 0%, and here's parallax at 100%. If you can see a difference between these two, let me know. I don't. Parallax is much better for things like carpet or brick, where there are strong deviations between the lowest and the highest points that you're looking at and not you're looking at directly. It doesn't work for smooth, lumpy things like water, in my experience. If you find parallax working for you, or if you turn it up to values higher than 100% and that works for you, go ahead. But I have not found much use for parallax when working with water. That covers the basics of the shaders. In the later videos, we'll cover a number of different things, such as the types of noise. Oh, and another thing I also wanted to add that I don't believe matters. In the rendering settings here, for the texture itself, if you go to noise, there are two options: dimensionality, 3D solid, or 2D wrapped. They vaguely change what this looks like, but it tends to still be, when you're applying it to a flat surface, pretty much the same. If we had applied this to a sphere, it might have looked a little different. It might have looked a little more bumpy from the inside to the outside, but for flat surfaces, flat geometry we're applying this to, this sort of detail doesn't seem to change. It just gives me two different variants. So as you can see here, there's the 2D wrapped dimensionality on the left and the 3D solid on the right. Both of them look like perfectly good options to me, and they look very similar. So that's your choice if you want. Next, we'll get into how to manage color, but I believe I will save that for another video.